If you could remember not to bring any food and drinks in here too, that would be great. This is a renovated space. My name is Sasha. I work for the Aspen Institute, and I edit the Aspen Idea magazine. You should definitely grab a copy. And so to keep this on time, I'm just going to bring him right out. Folks, David Brooks.
Thank you, Sasha, for that lavish and generous introduction. It's brought a tear to my eye. Well, this was billed as middle-age emotion, so there was supposed to be a couch out here, and I was just going to lie down and weep. If any of you are Germans, it's your turn to weep. They lost the World Cup semifinal just a few minutes ago. Spain won 1-0. No, I'm going to get to emotion, but I'm going to start by telling you a story, a happy story, a story about success. And what better place than Aspen to talk about successful people? It's sort of a loya jirga of successful people here. And I personally encounter them out on the hiking trails. You'll be walking up a trail. I walked up the American Lake Trail yesterday. And as happens often at Aspen, you'll be hiking up the trail and there'll be a little old guy whizzing by you like an F-18. And he's one of these 70-year-old fitness freaks, and sort of he's shrunk down with age. He's like 5 foot, 90 pounds, covered head to toe in spandex. He zooms up the trail past you, leaving a little wake of contempt. It's like being passed by a little iron raisinette going up there. And so these old guys are everywhere in Aspen. They've succeeded at everything they've ever done. They made a few $1 billion. They own 2 planes. They own 4 houses. They sponsor 3 charter schools to be good. They have 5 perfect sons named Bip, Chip, Rip, Tip, and Lip. They married a series of beautiful women, and so if he's like 5 foot, usually they marry a series of like 5 6-footers in a row, which is 30 feet of combined woman. And they achieve a sort of genetic miracle. So while their own mother looked like Gertrude Stein, their granddaughters look like Uma Thurman. And so now they're 70 years old, and they just decide to beat the crap out of death. They're not going to do it. So they hire a personal trainer. They take up windsurfing at age 75. They're popping Cialis like breath mints. If women were turned on by conversations about cholesterol, they'd have a different babe every night. And they've entered what you could call their Pluto adolescence, which is they can now afford to do everything they wanted to do as teenagers. So they're like these little raging libidos without platinum Amex cards. And they're sort of downtown, traveling in packs in Aspen, sort of a vortex of smugness in athletic sandals. They've dyed their hair gold to match the interior of their jet. Their life is so calm and cool and together, they make Dick Cheney look bipolar. And so this is, what you're thinking is, how can I be rich and healthy and popular like these guys? And there's a conventional story about how to get that way. You get born with a superior IQ, you have awesome good looks or some other tremendous trait. You go to such and such a school and make the honor roll. You have high SAT scores. You go to a prestigious college, graduate school, and get an advanced degree, an MBA, a law degree, medical degree. You read self-help improvement books, In Search of Excellence, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, everything Malcolm Gladwell's ever written. And you become a great decision maker, a great executive, and a great manager. And that's one version and one story of how you become successful like that. But I'm going to tell you a different story of how one becomes successful, maybe not quite like that. And I actually think it's a more important story. We're living in a revolution in consciousness. We've learned more about the mind in the past 30 years than we did in the previous 3,000. And one of the central findings of this research is that we're not primarily the products of our conscious decision-making. We're primarily the products of thinking and cognition and imagination and emotion that goes on below the level of awareness. So the human mind is capable of taking in about 11 pieces of information a minute, of which it can be conscious of about 40. And the rest is being processed in there. And over the past 30 years, in just tremendously exciting field, neuroscientists, psychologists, cognitive scientists, sociologists, and others have been shining flashlights into this hidden kingdom of the unconscious. And they're learning it's not a primitive zone of animal passion. It's not a dark zone of repressed sexual urges. It's where some of the most impressive and complicated thinking takes place. And a different kind of thinking than is the voice in our head. And so if the conscious mind is like a general sitting atop a platform, analyzing a battlefield, thinking in ways that are logical and linear and linguistic, the unconscious mind is like a million little scouts, permeating the landscape and coding things with emotional attachments. So you come across an old friend and you feel a surge of affection. You see heroic action, you feel a surge of admiration. You see unfairness, you feel a surge of anger and disgust, and you don't have to think about this. What these emotional scouts do is they assign values. They tell us what we want, what to love, what to hate. They guide us forward like a GPS system, except for instead of an atonal voice, there's emotion guiding us forward. Now, I'm a middle-aged man. I'm generally uncomfortable with discussion of emotion. There's a great apocryphal brain scan story. They took a bunch of middle-aged guys, put them in a fMRI machine, and then they had them watch a horror movie, and then they had them describe their feelings toward their wives. And the brain scans were identical in both circumstances. It's just sheer panic and terror. And as my wife can tell you, that's about where I am. But I wanted to talk to you about this enchanted world of the unconscious because I think what the scientists are finding will, but has not yet had, a huge effect on social thought. And because my world, the world of policy and politics, hasn't even begun to grapple with what they're finding. And because there's a bias in our culture. We're really good at talking about reason and material things, but we're really bad at talking about emotion. We can talk about materialism, but we're terrible about talking about character and how character forms. So I thought I'd talk to you about emotion, but the scary thing for me is that I just thought I'd do it in the form of a story, what I call social science performance art. And I've never done this before. I wrote this morning, and it could be a big disaster, which would be historic to be witness. But I wanted to show you in as concrete terms as possible how unconscious skills grow and develop and how they really play out in real life. So I thought I'd introduce you to a newborn little baby named Erica, who was born to a Chinese-American mother and a Mexican-American father who planned on getting married someday but haven't gotten married yet and actually never will. Erica's 1 hour old. She opens her eyes and makes visual contact with her mother. She has nothing like what we would call consciousness. Kids, until they're about 18 months or 3, really don't have a sense that they can control their own minds. But she is capable of sophisticated cognition. In 1979, there was a guy named Alan Meltzoff, who was at the Ideas Festival last year, who began a change in the way we understand babies. Alan he went to a baby who was 42 minutes old, and he put his head down and he wagged his tongue in front of the baby. And the baby wagged her tongue back. This was at 42 minutes. And this experiment has been now replicated many, many times. And it's opened up this avenue into how infants think. And what we've learned, we used to think they were blank slates who thought nothing. Now we know they're capable of very impressive intellectual feats, even though they really don't have consciousness. They will cry in sympathy with other babies in the nursery, but they will not cry in sympathy to a recording of their own voice. They can distinguish one language over another. They can distinguish one poem over another. If you read them Cat in the Hat 6 times, they'll suck on their pacifier a certain way, and then if you switch, they'll stop sucking because the comfort level is not there. Infants are fantastic at reading faces. You take 6 months old, they can distinguish between different monkey faces, something adults are not capable of doing. Japanese infants are capable of distinguishing between the R and the L sound, which is an ability they lose as they get older. And so the question, that's just a fact, it's because in the language, Weird. So Erica's at an early age, and what does she want? Well, the first thing is she's desperate for affection. These famous Harry Harlow monkey experiments where they had a monkey with a bottle and a monkey with a washcloth, mothers, found that monkeys will give up food in exchange for softness, and they need to feel good to survive. And it is literally a matter of survival. In the 1960s, they built orphanages which they thought were going to reduce infections, so they isolated the babies and they didn't handle them. The babies had such high mortality rates, about 30 or 40%, that they stopped giving them names because they were dying so quickly. And they were getting perfectly good food and water, but they lacked the physical contact. And that's because babies need affection in order to build their own brains. Rat pups who are licked have 25% more synapses than rat pups who are not. In the 1930s, a scientist named H.M. Skeels studied mentally disabled orphans. And some of the orphans at this orphanage were adopted. After 4 years, he measured their IQs, and the adopted orphans had IQs 50 points higher than the orphans that were not adopted. And it's not because the mothers were tutoring them, because the mothers were themselves mentally disabled and living in a different institution. It was simply the mother's love that had wired the brain and produced this 50-point IQ spike. And so what Erica wants is a merger with her mother's mind, and she needs it in order to create her own mind. So you picture them one night. Erica's lying on her mother's chest, nursing. Her mother's in one of those chairs with all the things you get at baby showers these days, monitors, cribs, air purifiers, video cameras, brain arousing mobiles. She looks like a sort of a milkmaid sitting in the Starship Enterprise, surrounded by technology. And it looks kind of peaceful. But inside, what her mother is screaming is, "Help, help, help, I hate this thing." Because it's the middle of the night and she's exhausted. Babies demand attention every 20 seconds, on average. Mothers in the first year of a child's life lose 700 hours of sleep. Marital satisfaction levels plunge 70%. And that's because in order to survive, what little Erica's doing is invading her mother's mind and getting in there and reshaping it. We have what are called mirror neurons, somewhat controversial, but mirror neurons essentially are regular neurons, but they replicate what they see inside your own mind. So we're not distant from each other. When you see someone pick up a glass in your own mind, your brain is replicating picking up a glass. When you watch a car chase in a movie, your brain is behaving as if it itself were being chased. The reason pornography is so successful is because the brains of people watching pornography are just like the brains of people actually having sex at lower concentration. So what Erica was doing was deeply penetrating and interfering with her mother's brain because she needed that mind merger in order to organize her own mind. And this thing wasn't being done by words. Obviously, Erica couldn't talk yet. It was being done by gestures. 90% of emotional content, emotional communication, is done not with words, but with gestures. And it's done by the movement of hands, feet, facial expressions. It's what the scientists call paraconversations. A psychology class played a trick on one of their professors using this. He was one of these professors who would wander up and down the stairway, the stage as he spoke. And they decided before class, when he was over here, they'd look at him. And when he was over on this side of the stage, they would look down at their notebooks. Within about 5 minutes, he was out the door over there. And he had no idea what was going on. He just felt better over there. And he was picking it up unconsciously. So the point is, and the philosophical point is, from childhood on, we're not individuals who form relationships. It's the relationships that come first that physically form individuals. And we have and live in a very individualistic culture, but in important ways, that's the wrong way to look at human beings. We are deeply interpenetrated with each other. Now, Erica, through the course of her childhood, had a lot of happy things going on, some not so happy, some rough patches. Her mother would tell her stories. Erica would sit on the floor, put a piece of plastic in her mouth, and her mother would talk and just tell long stories. Some of them were about a drive she took across the country before Erica was born, some of how her ancestors lived in China. Some of them were about how her family came across the Pacific, and the stories would ebb and flow with Erica's needs. Her mother did the crucial thing, which is to understand Erica's moods, when she needed to be excited, when she needed to be calm. And so as a result, we would say Erica was firmly attached. Scientists look at how children attach to their parents, and it's one of the most important ways you can predict what's going to happen in a person's life. 55% of the kids, roughly in middle-class homes, are what they call firmly attached. That means their parents respond to them in predictable ways to their moods. And so they go through life with these working models of how relationships happen. And people who are securely attached assume that people will respond to them in sensible ways. They tend to be trusting. They tend to be good at making friends. 20% of infants are what they call avoidantly attached. They sent out signals to mom and dad, but got nothing in return. And so as they get older, they seem very mature because they're very self-contained. But they have trouble getting close to other people, and they tend to preemptively withdraw. And so I read a great description from a teacher who had an avoidantly attached child in her classroom. And the child would come into the room every morning like a sailboat tacking into the wind. Wanted to get close to the teacher, just didn't know how to do it. The remaining 20% are called disorganized attachments. And these are people who got mixed and incoherent signals from their parents. And these people do not know how to build relationships and find it very hard. They hug and fight their mothers at the same time. If you give them a shot in the doctor's office, their cortisol levels spike up because they're living in with constant stress. They tend later in life to have much more active sexual lives. They become much more promiscuous. Now, these early attachment patterns don't determine a life. Nothing is that baked in the cake. But they shape a pathway, and they're working models that can be changed but have powerful influences all through life. The University of Minnesota, a very great longitudinal study, looked at the attachment patterns, and at age 4, they could predict with 77% accuracy who was going to drop out of high school. And adding IQ did not improve those predictions. So attachment is just tremendously important. The second thing Erica had was self-control. And I never stopped talking about my favorite social science experiment, which was done by a guy named Walter Mischel. And I've used it here at Aspen, but I'm going to say it again. And some of you probably know it's called the Marshmallow Experiment. And Mischel took 4-year-olds, put them in a room, put a marshmallow in front of them, and said, you can eat this marshmallow now, but I'll come back in 10 minutes. If you haven't eaten the marshmallow, I'll give you 2 marshmallows. And he showed me the videos of the kids trying not to eat the marshmallows. There's a little girl banging her head on the table, trying not to eat the marshmallow. One day, Mischel was using an Oreo cookie, and the little guy picks up the Oreo, carefully eats out the middle, and carefully puts it back on the middle. That kid is now a U.S. Senator. But the scary thing about Mischel's experiment is the kids who could wait 8, 10, 12 minutes, 20 years later have much higher college completion rates, and 30 years later, much higher incomes. The kids who can only wait 1 minute, some kids just pop the marshmallow right in, they have much higher drug and alcohol addiction problems and much higher incarceration rates 20 years later. And that's because some kids grow up in homes where actions lead to consequences, and they develop strategies to control their impulses. And if you grow up in that home, school will be okay. If you can't control your impulses, if you don't have strategies, school will be miserable and the rest of your life will suck. And that's just part of the unconscious formation of how we see and interpret the world. Now, all of this was going well because Erica had self-control. She had good attachment patterns. But as she got older, things got a little tougher for her. Her mother never got married, and one of the reasons was she had periods of depression. And starting in junior high, she had some long and deep periods of depression. She would tape shut all the windows in their apartment. She would stop showering. She would self-medicate with booze and drugs, and Erica had to clean it up. They would move down into poor neighborhoods, and Erica would remember the days when she had put all her belongings in these cheap plastic bags and had to go to some rancid apartment in a terrible neighborhood. She learned how to get her mother checked into the hospital when she needed to, how to survive on bologna from the bodega when she needed to, how to tell everyone at school that her mother had asthma in order to cover up what was going to happen. And she found herself at these odd downward spiral moments in crappy, horrible neighborhoods. And she deduced in these new neighborhoods, and she was in junior high, that you can never take shit from anybody in these places. The weak are cold and the strong survived, and she had to get tougher. And she became a harder and more difficult person. And she was surrounded by families who did not have some of the advantages that middle-class families have. Some of them you probably know of. Children of professional parents hear about 487 words an hour. Children on welfare hear 187 words an hour. Over the course of a childhood, the difference in number of words heard by a middle-class kid and a poor kid is 32 million fewer words. And that has an effect. There's also a difference in the tenor of the words. Middle-class kids are praised for everything. Kids in some of these more disorganized homes, most of what they hear is negative and critical. And so she was in a world of different social norms. People in these neighborhoods were twice as likely to be obese, twice as likely to smoke, much less likely to plan for the future, much less social trust, much less thinking about the future. But Erica did have one heroic insight. When she was in these neighborhoods, the insight was she couldn't get herself out on her own. She'd perish in this environment. And this was a key instinct because even the best of us, or the most privileged, have trouble controlling our own minds. But we can control the contexts in which we live, and these contexts shape us in a million ways that we don't really understand. We have the choice to join the Marine Corps, to go to church, or not. And Erica understood that she needed to find some better place to surround herself with. Now, at about that time, a charter school opened up in her neighborhood, which was called the Academy. And Erica knew that the kids there, she saw them, they had these nice uniforms, which she didn't have. She knew they got food there, and she knew they had big, nice new basketball courts. So she went to a social welfare agency, and she said she wanted to go to the Academy. And they turned her away. They said she didn't have any legal residence in the neighborhood, in the district, and she refused to leave, and they physically had to get her and pull her out of the office and throw her out of the building. So she spent the next couple of weeks hanging around the Academy itself. She hung around the students, she hung around the fences, excuse me, and one day she heard there was a meeting inside, a meeting of all the big wigs at the Academy. She snuck into the school through the back door, some students were leaving, and she found a room, and she burst in. And there was a big table there with 25 adults sitting around. And immediately they barked at her, "What are you doing here? How'd you get in here?" And she said, "I want to go to your school next year." And they didn't want to hear about it. They said, "How'd you get in here? You shouldn't be here." And she just repeated it, "I want to go to your school next year." And one of the founders of the school explained, "Well, we have a lottery system. If you give your name, we'll enter your name in the lottery to get into our school." And she didn't back down. She just said, "That's a way of saying, no, I need to go to your school. I need to go to college." And she gave them a long speech on the grades she had earned in junior high school and how hard she worked and how much she deserved to be in the Academy. Now, around the table, there was a big fat man sitting on one side of the table with big suspenders, and he was the hedge fund manager who funded large parts of this school. And he listened to her speech, and he pulled out a Mont Blanc pen from his pocket, which she'd never seen before, and he wrote something on a piece of paper, and he slipped it across to the founders of the Academy. And on the paper it read, "Rig the fucking lottery." And the founder looked at her and gave her a stern lecture. He told her never to burst into rooms like this, never interrupt a meeting, never be rude and make demands. Then he walked up to her, handed her a piece of paper, and said, "Write down your name and address, and we'll see you in September." And she did, and she walked away. And after she was out of earshot, the whole room burst into laughter, because they knew if they were attracting kids like that, they were probably doing something right. So Erica got to go to the Academy, and it was different from her other school. The jargon in educationese is that it was parent neutral, but it was really replacing the culture of her neighborhood. They spent hours at the Academy on how to nod, how to look people in the eye, how to say "excuse me." They had chants every morning. So a teacher would scream at the kids, "What is earned?" And the kids would all scream back, "Everything is earned." And they went through this military discipline day after day. And they gave her a sense of the promised land of getting into college. And her graduation date was not the year of her high school graduation date. It was 4 years hence when she would graduate from college. And it gave her, most importantly, a sense of an ordered existence. And this was important because hundreds of studies have been done on what leads, especially to business success. And the quick answer is there's no one personality trait what leads to business success. But there is a most common trait. And hundreds of studies have come back, and they tend to congregate around the same traits: attention to detail, persistence, efficiency, the ability to work long hours. And so in high school, Erica became super organized. She got out a notebook calendar. She tried to read the Wall Street Journal. She became very prim and proper and articulate. She became sort of a ghetto Doris Day. And she lost some of her the respect of her friends who thought she'd sold out. She felt she'd lost some of her integrity. But in 10th grade, she made the honor roll. And at an assembly, they awarded her a blue shirt she got to wear to class, which was the proudest moment of her life to that point. So she did okay in the SATs, not so great. But through the strength of her rise and the recommendations of her teachers, she got to go to college, the University of Denver, not too far from here. And she got out not because she was the greatest IQ, but she did have the ability to work, the ability to tune to others, the ability to control her impulses, and she also had a sense of existential danger. If you look at the great figures of world history, an amazing number of them have had a parent die between the ages of 8 and 12. And it's just historical studies have been done on this. And when they lose that parent at that crucial age, they just get a sense that life is precarious and they got to work like hell. I, by the way, already tell my kids that I failed them because they're. But Erica lost contact with her mother at those age, and she did have that sense of existential danger. So she went to college, and she suddenly was in the world of upper middle class kids who seemed, compared to the kids she grew up with, forever ahead. If they talked about the Battle of Agincourt, those kids had already been there. If they made a reference to Bob Dylan, those kids knew all about Bob Dylan. And she got the sense the kids back in her neighborhood were forever behind. But she did have some advantages. And one of the advantages she had was the stories her mother used to tell her about life in China. And she had imbibed a certain culture that some of these kids didn't have. And there's a great deal of research that's been done on Asian culture versus an American culture. And the crude summary of it is, in Asia, people are more likely to see relationships, and in America, we're more likely to see individuals. They show people in both cultures a fish tank. And in China, they describe the surroundings of the tank, the movements of the fish, the plant vegetation in the tank. Americans tend to just pick out the biggest fish and describe that one. They give them their word experiment, 3 words: cow, chicken, and grass. And they ask people to lump 2 of these words together. Americans tend to link cow and chicken together because they're both animals. Asians and Chinese tend to link cow and grass together because cows eat grass. They have a relationship with the grass. When Chinese tourists look at the Mona Lisa and American tourists look at the Mona Lisa, the saccades, the movements of their eyes are totally different. Americans focus on the face. The Chinese tourists have much more eye movement, focusing on the context. And these different mental processes are even visible in brain research. When you ask an American to solve a math problem, you see a lot of activity in the linguistic areas of the brain. When you ask Chinese, you're more likely to see activity in the visual areas of the brain. So these cultural differences are not superficial things. They're deeply, permanently wired in. Not permanently, but deeply wired in. And she had absorbed this unconsciously. And she'd also had these experiences through her life of being in lots of different sorts of places. Middle-class neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, Chinese culture, American culture, neighborhood friends, academy friends. She'd seen different parts of herself come out in different settings. She'd seen people behaved in highly irrational ways. Dropping out of high school when that was almost a sentence of lifelong poverty, getting pregnant as a teenager, the same. And she was aware not only of the conscious world above the waterline, the stuff that was talked about in class, technical knowledge and rational behavior, but she was much more aware, because of this diverse upbringing, of the things that go on below the level of consciousness. And she had sort of a deep vision, which I think helped her through life. And this sort of deep vision, the ability to see not only the surface but the deep down, helped her in some serious ways. The first, it helped her evaluate other people. There are many people in life who are sort of smitten by the idea of IQ. And IQ is important, and it's great at predicting success in school-like settings. But even there, once you get above 120, you really don't learn much. People at 120 do just as well as people at 150. And it's a terrible predictor at predicting most other fields. There have been giant surveys of IQ and whether it predicts success in most careers, and the surveys tend to find that it predicts about 4 and 20% of the variance in job performance. So IQ is kind of important, but not really that important in most jobs. Smart people do not make better marital decisions. They're not better at raising kids. They're not more trustworthy. They're not even that much better at chess, surprisingly. Chess performance is relatively unrelated to IQ once you get above a certain level. And that's because what's much more important, and there's a guy named Keith Stanovich who's written a lot about this, is not the IQ, but the mental disposition. IQ is nestled in mental character traits. Are you curious? Are you open-minded? Do you adjust the strength of your conclusion to the strength of the evidence? Are you comfortable with ambiguity? Are you modest when you only have partial knowledge? Stanovich has tried to measure this and compare them to IQ, and he's found that these traits, these really virtues, mental virtues, are mostly unrelated to IQ scores, and they're much more important. So Erica could see down and see into the deeper traits rather than just the test scores and the IQ. The second thing is she was pretty good at anticipating how people would actually behave. We have a vast apparatus of social science, which I pay a lot of attention to, which is based on mathematical models, all of economics and a lot of other fields. And these models are based on a simplified view of human nature, that people are rational, autonomous, utility-maximizing creatures who make decisions on the basis of cost-benefit analysis. Well, Erica was around people who dropped out of high school, and she knew that wasn't true, because they didn't behave that way. And when she went into the world of business, she was around people who knew that wasn't true either. Grocers put the fruit section in front of the grocery store because they know if you feel good about buying some pomegranates, by the time you get back to the cereal section, you'll give yourself permission to buy Fruit Loops. They know that restaurateurs know that the larger the party, the more people eat. People dining alone eat the least. People eating with one other person eat 35% more. People dining with 3 other people eat 75% more. They're not aware of these things, but these things happen because things are flowing into their minds. And so the lesson, and this is really the core lesson of behavioral economics, is that in many circumstances, we're playing a game we don't understand. We think we're making decisions, but there are all sorts of influences coming through our unconscious minds which are really shaping and biasing the way we lead our lives. So people named Dennis are disproportionately likely to become dentists. People named Lawrence are disproportionately likely to become lawyers. And that's because people have a vague sense that they like the familiar. And words that sound familiar they gravitate toward them, which is why I've named my own son President of the United States, Brooks. Then there's the example of priming. We're influenced by the words that we hear, even in unrelated circumstances. If I give you the words bingo, Florida, Social Security, when you walk out of this room, you will walk more slowly than if I'd given you words related to youthfulness. It permeates. Asian American women, if you remind Asian American women that they're Asian and then give them a math test, their scores go up. If you remind them they're women, their scores go down. And this actually has a serious component, which has been much written about by Claude Steele, that if you remind African Americans of African American stereotypes, they do worse on the tests. Just that one reminder. And so we're deeply affected by a lot of these, what they call priming. Then there's anchoring. A $39 bottle of wine may seem expensive, not to people in this room, but to other people. But it seems cheaper when it's sitting on the shelf next to a $150 bottle of wine, which is why those bottles are in the wine stores. Then there's anchoring. That is anchoring. And then there's, I'll quickly arousal. Dan Ariely, the great behavioral economist, took a bunch of kids, showed them pornography on laptops covered with saran wrap, and then asked them, would you be willing to have sex with a 12-year-old? Before, it was like 30% say, but in the middle of the arousal, 70% said they would. These are hugely powerful effects. And so Erica was sort of more aware of the irrational ways that people make decisions. And finally, I think it helped her in her course of her business career, separating people who are rationalists from those who are wise. Rationalists are the people who come up with management theories and computer models. They break problems down into discrete parts. They measure reality according to what can be counted and calculated. And they try to reduce human behavior to equations. And this is what macroeconomics is about. And PowerPoint slides. This is what most of business is about. And in some way, they're children of the French Enlightenment. The French Enlightenment emphasized reason and the power of reason to liberate us from superstition and myth. And they tend to have some skills, but wise people tend to be children of the British Enlightenment. The British Enlightenment did not emphasize reason. The British Enlightenment was led by people like David Hume, Adam Smith, and Edmund Burke. They emphasized the sentiments. They said the power of our reason is impressive but bounded. The real strong thing we have is our sentiments, our reactions to the world, our aesthetic reactions to a mountain, our reactions to moral actions. And they had tremendous respect for our sentiments, even though we knew we couldn't really get to the depths of them and understand them. And so they proceeded with a phrase called epistemological modesty. It's a way of acting in the world that says, the world is too complicated for me to know and understand, and so I will work with a sense of modesty, awareness of the limits of my own understanding. I will not try to deduce the world into abstract logical formulae. And it suggests a different way of learning, a way of learning which is not about calculation and adding up and building abstract systems. It's about wandering, and it's about absorbing sensations as you go through life, internalizing the structures of a field. When chess masters see a chessboard, they do not see chess pieces. They see formations of pieces. And so they have a much more complicated way of seeing the world than people who are not chess masters. It's about mastering the structure of a field and then bringing it into the structure of another field. What Picasso did essentially was take the structure of modern art, which was its own field, delve into it, absorb its patterns, and then delve into the world of African masks and absorb its patterns. And then unconsciously, he brought these two patterns together. And that was the source of a lot of the creativity in one part of his field. And people who do this develop a knack for a field. And sometimes this knack, this unconscious intuition about a field, which takes long work and arduous traveling and wandering and experience, can be truly impressive. At chicken farms, chicken sexers pick up 800 chicks an hour. And they can predict with 99% accuracy which are male chicks and which are female chicks. And you ask them, how do they do it? They don't know. They just know there's something about the chicks. Soldiers in Iraq, there was a good story in the New York Times about this. Certain soldiers had an ability to notice that they were beginning to feel cold while driving down the street. And that feeling of coldness came about when subconsciously they became aware of an IED, an explosive device, around. And certain soldiers, their buddies knew they had this ability, and they paid attention. Are you feeling cold? Are you feeling cold? Artists and athletes lose the cautious thought process and get lost in the craft and the sport. They have what the Greeks called metis, which is this unconscious wisdom, this awareness. Antonio Damasio was here last year as well, gave people 2 decks of cards and a game. They would draw from each deck and try to amass points. But one of the decks of cards had much higher risk of losing a lot of points. And he just had people pick decks, and he found that by the 10th pick or so, the 10th round of the game, as they reached for the risky pack, the sweat would start flowing on their hands. He would ask them, do you see any difference between the 2 packs? Consciously, they did not. But in their body and unconsciously, they already saw the difference. And people would begin figuring out the game at about the 10th, and everybody had figured it out by the 50th round, even though they still couldn't tell you consciously why they were picking from this deck and not that one. And he would ask them, why are you picking? And they would say, well, I sort of like that one better. But they really didn't have a sense of the risks involved. And so these are unconscious tasks that are tremendously impressive that are being done at the level of awareness. One of the most cognitively demanding things any of us do is furniture shopping. Going into a furniture store and trying to imagine how a sofa will look in your house is really hard. And so some Dust researchers tested people as they did this and tried to figure out what's the best way to make this decision. The worst way to make this decision is by sudden instinct. Make a snap decision. That was the worst. The second worst way was to make a list of pros and cons. Irrationally try to figure it out. The best way was to look at all the furniture, do some other task while unconsciously you sort of were figuring out the furniture, and then an hour or 2 later make a decision. And because all that time your mind's sort of figuring it out. And that worked for furniture, it's worked for posters. It's just one of the ways, impressive ways, that the unconscious is not stupid. It's kind of smart. And so Erica had all these abilities, and they helped her in business, and by age 30, she'd become a consultant. She was doing mergers and acquisitions, and she was a tough negotiator. Her happiest or most rewarding moment came when she heard a story of someone asking who was representing a company in a deal, and the guy said, well, Erica's representing us. And the guy at the other end of the deal said, Shit, why don't I give you $1 billion and get it over with? And to her, that was a story of how tough she was. But she still had her normal needs, and she wanted to become married and have a family. And so one day she was set up on a blind date, and she was set up to meet a guy named Harold in front of a Barnes & Noble. And both of them, when they saw each other at the Barnes & Noble for the first time, made instant judgments. Harold made incredibly impressive. He was very impressed by Erica. All men at all stages, like women, with a 0.7 waist-to-hip ratio, which Erica had. She, too, made an instant judgment. And the power of these judgments can be powerful. There's a Princeton research team that had a group of people look at rival politicians, gave them a glimpse for 1/10 of a second. And from those 1/10 of a second looks, they could predict with 70% accuracy who was going to win the election between those two people. And so these are powerful. And so Erica was doing the calculations that all of us do. Women tend to like men who are slightly older, stronger, and taller than themselves, though online dating studies have found that a guy who's 5'6" can get as many online date offers as a guy who's 6 foot, so long as he makes $172,000 a year more. Don't ask me how I know that. So she saw Harold across the way, and he passed the symmetrical test. He didn't wear any sports jewelry. Erica didn't want to marry a man who loved Derek Jeter more than herself. He didn't wear a Burberry raincoat. She couldn't see herself looking at that damn pattern for the rest of her life. He didn't wear cologne. She viewed scented men the way Churchill viewed Germany. They're either at your throat or at your feet. And so she was looking for something deeper. And it is true, while the conscious mind wants money, status, and fame, the unconscious mind wants something else. It wants harmony. It wants the patterns that make up the unconscious mind to harmonize with the patterns around. And so when a craftsman is lost in his craft, they're experiencing that state, which you could call limerence. When a naturalist feels at one with nature, they're also experiencing limerence. When a believer is at one with God's love, they also feel it. And when lovers are fused, they feel it. And that is the most delicious pleasure, which is the great motivator. And this is actually also measurable in the mind. The brain is perpetually anticipating the future. And the brain anticipates something, and then that something happens, you get a little drip of rewarding juice. And that's the physical correlation of this deep desire to be in harmony with the people around you. And so Harold and Erica had a meal together, and they found that they had gone to the same rock concerts. They had the same opinions about the characters in the Breakfast Club. They used the same and harmonized the same vocabularies. One of the things we all do when we're conversing is we unconsciously harmonize with the people we're talking with. So people with IQs of 80 or so will use words like fabric, enormous, and conceal, but people with IQs of about 90 will use words like sentence, consume, and commerce. And so over the course of a conversation, we very quickly figure out what conversational level the other person is at, and we harmonize with them. And Harold and Erica were doing great together. Harold had unfortunately ordered one of those salads where the green leaves splay across both sides of your face when you shove it in your mouth. So he sort of had some salad dressing. But they were doing the gestures people do when they're falling in love. Women in love do what they call the head cant, which is the tilting of the head that exposes the neck. This is science, baby. Men do what they call the anchoring gaze, which is the long look into someone else's eyes, and they were meshing with each other. Now, in the course of the relationship, people mesh, and they pick people who mesh in very deep ways. One of the things that's fascinating me is people tend to marry at great regularity people with immune systems that are complementary to their own, to improve the immune levels of their kids. The sense of smell turns out to be extraordinarily powerful in courtship. One of the experiments that horrifies me was done by some researchers who took gauze pads, taped it under the underarms of people who were watching a movie. And they had some people watch a horror movie and some people watch a comedy. Then they collected the gauze pads and had some other research subjects, who I assume were well paid, to sniff the gauze pads. And those people who sniffed the gauze pads could tell with much better than average chance which gauze pad had been worn by a horror movie viewer and which had been worn by a comedy viewer. And women, by the way, were twice as good at this as men. And so they're smithing, they're getting together, and they begin to live together. And like any couple that's getting together, they each have certain unconscious mental maps about how the world works. Harold thought toilet paper should roll this way. She thought it should roll that way. Harold thought dishes should be placed in the sink and then washed at the end of the day. Erica thought they should be washed immediately and put in the dishwasher. When they went to the grocery store, Harold bought complete meal products, so packet of tortellini, frozen pizza, quiche. Erica bought ingredients, eggs, milk, flour. Harold would be amazed she'd spend $200 and there'd still be nothing to eat. But they overcame these difficulties and they fell in love. And they didn't make a conscious choice to fall in love with each other, but it welled up inside, and it welled up like an addiction. In fact, in a brain scan, people in love look like they're in the midst of a cocaine addiction. And this is how the most important decision of their lives was made, and this is how most decisions are made, by emotions deciding what we value, what we want, and what we should chase. And so it came up from deep below, and the relationship was not always perfect. They had moments in the course of the decades of their marriage when it was bad and they thought about divorce. Erica's career was not perfect. She started companies that failed. She worked for jerks a lot of the time. But she did have a long, fulfilling life, gave back to her community. And she did, in the course of these things, have this vision that allowed her to see patterns in the world, to anticipate things that were going to happen. And she had character, the ability to control her impulses, and to know what would satisfy her deeply and what would only satisfy her in shallow ways. And so it was mostly a happy and fulfilling life. And she softened a little as she got older, and she retired here in Aspen. They got a house on the North Fork River, and they sat around on a porch watching the rafters go by, and Harold used to think of a story he had heard that she had told him about a Chinese guy who was asked, "What's the happiest moment in your life?" And the Chinese guy looked sheepishly and said, "Well, my wife once went to Beijing, and she had some delicious chicken, which she would talk about when she returned. And so I would have to say the happiest moment of my life was my wife's trip and the chicken she ate there." And so Harold would think of his life and his devotion to Erica, and he would think, well, the happiest moment of his life was Erica earning that blue shirt at the academy, and the happiness he saw in her when she would talk about it. And they got older, and she got sick and went to the hospital once a year, and she was old, and it was hard to move. And she was sitting one day on the porch over the North Fork River, looking across at the rafters going by and looking across some pictures of her own self, memories and memorabilia. She came across a picture of herself when she was 6 or 7, and she was atop a playground slide. It was winter somewhere, and she had blue coat and mittens on. And her mother must have taken that picture. And she asked herself, looking at that picture, what do I have in common with that girl? And so many things had changed in the course of her life, but there was something alive in that 6-year-old girl that was still alive in her now, certain viewpoints, certain ways of reacting, certain hopes and fears. And she looked at that picture, and she could feel how that kid must have been feeling. Somehow, even across the decades, she had some of the same cast of characters in her head, the same unconscious essence that we call the soul, which starts with affections and turned by some miracle into neurons and synapses, and then emerges through another miracle into consciousness. And she was looking at that picture, and Harold asked if she wanted to have some lunch. And he went in and got her some cold chicken. And he came out with a chicken on a plate, and when he got out on the porch, he dropped the plate onto the ground and ran over to her. And she was inert in the chair, drifting in and out of consciousness, and there were sort of images flowing through her head, front stoop as a girl, a day at the beach she had had, her mother washing her hair in the sink, playing with dolls and toys when she was little. And through the fog of her mind, she was vaguely aware of Harold out there somewhere, and she felt intensely sorry for him. And then what we would say is she lost consciousness entirely, and categories fell away, along with the awareness of herself, the awareness of death. And it was like it was just when she was born, just a series of direct sensations of the world, of music, images, sounds, and just presences. And so she passed away, and what she'd achieved in life was a viewpoint of not seeing others superficially, but seeing others more deeply, not only seeing people as chess pieces, but as deeper currents, as souls engaged in conversation. And so I got into this subject, and I told you this story, because in my world, we're in a world of policy analysts and macroeconomics, and we're often oblivious to these deeper emotional currents, which, when you actually look at a life, are actually so central to a life. And so we do the things we try to do in the policy world. We try to increase high school graduation rates. We try to develop human capital. We try to close the achievement gap. We try to reduce poverty. We try to export capitalism to Russia and democracy to the Middle East. But these policies often produce disappointing results. And to me, it's because they're based on a shallow view of human nature, who we really are and what really motivates us, and what levers you really need to pull to make some change. And so my hope is that the cognitive revolution by people like Damasio and so many other people who visited Aspen will give us a new humanism, a new view of who we are. And my hope is that we'll be able to take the findings of the cognitive revolution and that someday apply them to social thought and public life and have a series of policies and a series of ways of relating to each other which are deeper than what we have now and more successful. So thank you for your attention. Thank you. Thank you. Now, I don't know if that kind of talk arouses questions, but if anybody would like to get up here and cry, we'd be fine too. So if there are any questions. There's a question over here. I only write about this stuff, lady.
No, I'm Norman Belmont. I've been reading you for the last several years in the Times. I've seen you, what appears to me to be evolve from politics on a conservative side, more to the center, and much more of a social philosopher. Is this intentional, or is this the way you have always been, or is this the way I perceive you?
One should never trust one's perceptions, unless unconsciously. You know, I've always been a believer. Tom Wolfe was once asked, what's the most important thing that happened in your lifetime? And he said, oh, that's easy, co-ed dorms. And what he meant by that, or at least what I take to him have meant by that, is that, you know, politics makes a difference, but the most important things that happen in social are the autonomous decisions of just social individuals. The social contagions that sweep through a society and change the way we think, the way we orient ourselves in the world. Even politics I see as deeply social and deeply emotional. Again, to quote Tom Wolfe, he has a theory of the high school opposite, that when you're in high school, you know what clique you fall into, and you know which clique is your opposite. So if you're in the theater crowd, maybe the jocks are your opposite. And as you go through life, you pick the party that is filled with people in your social identity that is against the party of your high school opposite. And that actually is backed up by research. How do people pick a party? Mostly they inherit it from their parents, but when they don't, they pick the party that is filled with people like themselves. And then they get the ideology of the party. That comes later. So a lot of what we do is this kind of social connection. And then I got into this stuff because I was wondering why 30% of kids were dropping out of high school when it is so irrational to do that. And second, you know, I would go to Russia. The Soviet Union was collapsing. And I'd go to the apartments, and the apartments were beautiful and nice and clean. You'd go out into the vestibule of the adjoining apartments, and the vestibule would smell of urine. It would be rotten. And you'd ask the people in the apartments, why don't you clean out your vestibule? And they would say, oh, I don't like so-and-so. My other neighbors are drunk. But the fact is, after 70 years of Soviet rule, they didn't know who was KGB, and they had no social trust. And so I was over there, and we had economists giving privatization plans with the Russians because we thought everything was about economics, but it was really about social trust. And so that was another lesson. And then finally, and a big thing for me, was Iraq. When Iraq happened, we thought you just decapitate a regime, you change a country. And I once asked a member of the Bush administration, and I can't tell you who she is, didn't you guys get the culture of Iraq wrong? And she said, well, I'm not sure I believe in culture. I think you change institutions, you change culture. And I just don't think that's true. I think there's science on my side. And so all of those events made me much more concerned with these deeper human elements. And that's sort of what led me in this direction. But I would say, and then the final thing I'll say is, we write about politics, it's tremendously important. But if you compare an Asian American kid living in New Jersey to an American Indian kid living in South Dakota, the odds are that Asian American kid will live 26 years longer. That's a gap of 26 years. Believe me, there is no public policy that produces outcome gaps that big. And that has to do with culture and economics and other things. So that's what drew me there. There's down here in the...
Thank you. Just based on just what you said, and so many of the sessions I've been here have said politics is broken in this country and so on. Are you wary of following politics and just say, I can't take this anymore and moving on?
Well, no, I'll still write my column. It's depressing time. Jane Harmon's here, she knows. She's more in the middle of it. I get to go hang out with brain scientists. And to me also, by the way, that is a social thing too. When you go to Capitol Hill, why is it so much more polarized? There are all these mechanical reasons, but I think it has to do with, first, the team mentality. And this is an extreme example, but I cite it occasionally. There was a French journalist who interviewed people in Rwanda who'd committed massacre, genocide. And one of the people he interviewed, or she interviewed, I think, had decapitated his neighbor of 25 years. And she said, well, what were you thinking of that person when you decapitated them? And he said, well, come to think of it, at that moment, I only saw him very vaguely. And I didn't really see him as a person. And it was just a member of the other tribe. And that's obviously a very extreme example. But what I observe, and Congressman Harmon can correct me, is that still sometimes personal relationships across the aisle, but when you get in the official business of politics, it becomes a much more tribal and team thing, and you have depersonal relationships. And then we also, because I think our social fabric has weakened, a lot of people, and people who watch the more partisan shows, their party has now become their ethnic affiliation. And they don't have anything else to attach to, so they attach to party. And when that happens, then compromise is no longer possible because giving away is loss of honor. And so that's also seen through this prism. But the fact is, politics is still tremendously important, and tremendously, by the way, brings out, this is a point Tocqueville made, brings out the highest virtues. People in public life are faced with these stern character tests, but there's no area of life that brings out such virtues when they succeed at those character tests. And so that's why I think politics is so important to pay attention to. In the middle there.
Thank you. Could you go back to the part you were referring to about the attributes that correlate highly with success, like curiosity? And also my pattern-seeking brain is trying to connect what Richard Florida was talking about this morning with regard to the rise of creativity as a requirement for economic success. And I'm wondering what your views are on that.
Right. Well, the first part, and this is a big debate people have, I guess I would call it the debate between Jack Welch and Jim Collins, the author of Good to Great. And Jack Welch was a tremendously charismatic leader, and he was a successful leader at GE. But the trait, I think most researchers, and as I said, there are examples of everything. But most researchers would say it's those traits that Jim Collins praises. The people who do one thing really well, and then they do it over and over and over again. Attention to detail. And, it's interesting how definitions of genius change. 50 years ago, you would think, most people would have said Mozart, genius, just came from God. He just had this power. Now the conventional view, Mozart, very talented guy, but many kids around, probably around Aspen, have raw talent just as much as him. But he happened to have a father who worked him phenomenally hard. He got his 10,000 hours in, and then he just worked hard and hard and hard. And you take a list, there was a study done of kids as they took up the violin, and they wanted to predict who would succeed with the violin and who would not. And it turned out musical ability at the beginning stage moderately predicted. It turned out IQ didn't predict. What predicted the best was a question they asked the kids. How long are you going to play the violin? Some kids said, I might play it for a few years. Some kids say, I want to play it in school. Some kids said, I'm a violinist. I'm going to play this thing my whole life. And if you put it as part of your identity and you work at it at that level, then you will be good at it. And especially if you practice what they call deliberate practice. Most people practice in the easiest possible way. The people who become good practice in the most boring and annoying way possible. So they have a music camp, which I read about in a book called The Talent Code. They slow down the symphony or whatever it is they're playing so slowly that if you can tell what piece of music they're playing, that's too fast. And that's just phenomenally slowly and painstaking. In the Russian tennis academies, for 4 months, the kids play tennis without a ball. They volley back and forth just to get the swing right. And that's the sort of fanatical devotion to practice that actually does lead to success. So it's that persistence and then just raw industriousness. One of the stories I admire is about Benjamin Franklin is that he wanted to teach himself to write better. So he said, who's the best writers right now? And there was a magazine in England called The Spectator. So what he would do was he would chop up The Spectator sentence by sentence and then try to scramble them, come back in a couple of weeks and try to put them in the right order, just to understand how it flowed. Then he realized his vocabulary wasn't good. So he took articles in The Spectator, turned them into poetry, and then 6 weeks later wrote them back into prose and compared his prose to the original article. Well, that's not fun, but it's the sort of meticulous work people do to improve. And so those, I would say, are the two things. And then finally on creativity, I've sort of forgotten what the question was, because Richard Florida, who we all write about the same stuff, but I haven't met him. But I guess the one thing I would say is my friend, Tom Friedman, and as you know, I'm the poor man's Tom Friedman. I tell these jokes about Tom, I rib him, but we are neighbors at the Times Bureau in D.C. I'm between Tom and Maureen Dowd, so it's a good neighborhood. But we're also neighbors, and I'll repeat a line, I think this is Gail Collins' line. I went to the Middle East with Tom recently, and I think Gail said, going to the Middle East with Tom is like going to the mall with Britney Spears. It's just yeah. The other story I tell about Tom is he's got a nicer office than me, and he's got a nicer house than me. And he lives about a quarter of a mile away, and my son and I was then 14, driving by Tom's house, and my son elbows me, points at Tom's house, and says, "Same job, Dad, same job." So anyway, this is a very long intro, but Tom writes a lot about globalization. I think globalization is important, but to me, the most important thing is the upsurge in cognitive demands. So information can travel around the world, but the most important space is the last 3 inches between the ear and the brain. And how that information is processed, interpreted, is just tremendously important. And in this economy, an economy where ideas follow money, and where we live in much more diverse social landscapes than ever before, the demand for emotional and social skills are just much higher than ever before. So to me, the cognitive revolution is a better paradigm for the challenges we face than globalization. And that it demands, in the space of a lot of people, creativity, something that was not demanded before. If you want to become one of the things, you look at the labor markets, people who are fungible, their wages are stagnating. People who are creative, their wages are growing. And so creativity, as I mentioned with Picasso, is essentially taking two idea spaces and merging them. That's what creativity is, and seeing what networks arise out of that. And so, I think what Florida writes is very useful. The other thing to be said before, I think he's, to my mind, and I've read him, but I haven't met him. I think he a little overemphasizes the cities where a lot of us would like to live, like Seattle, San Francisco, and underemphasizes cities which are also doing phenomenally well, like Dallas and Houston, which may have less artsy people, but have creativity of a different sort. In the front. This will be the last question.
A lot of people had spoken during this conference about the new generation that is our future for many reasons. Young adults today and teenagers have a way of communicating that we didn't have before. They could have 20 names in their phones, and they're texting simultaneously to others and sharing information. Do you see this? I mean, and it's nerve-wracking for parents who are trying to get their attention when they're with them. But do you see this as a silver lining? Is there a benefit to this interconnection, this constant sharing of communication? What do you think about this? Who is doing that? That could be a new reset and help in creativity.
Yeah, well, I often tell political candidates, if you want to win this election, promise that you will pass a law banning texting after 10 p.m. And every parent in America will vote for you, and you'll be happy. I guess my own view is I'm a little skeptical. And there are two studies and there are just two, but two studies I just came across recently. Kids in school, especially from lower income areas, during the summer, they have a summer slump. They go down. They just did a study where they gave those kids for 3 successive years 12 books at the start of the summer. Just giving them those 12 books was as effective as having them go to summer school all summer. Having the ability to read, and reading is first of all, it's demanding, gets them in touch with characters, but they see themselves as readers. Second study I happened to come across traced computer usage and internet uses and high-speed internet usage in San Francisco, into those areas, into those homes where it was increasing. Internet use was accompanied by declining test scores in math and reading. And so to me, that's yay reading, not so good for computers. But that's probably a little too simplistic. I would say it depends on how you use it. One of the things kids do, which I think is a complete plus as a parent, is they keep in touch with their parents. When I go to college campuses, I always ask kids, how many of you read newspapers in paper form? If I can get 5%, I'm happy. But then I ask them, how many of you have been in touch with your parents in the last 48 hours? 80%, 90%. In 1974, Gallup asked teenagers, would you be better off running away from home? 40% said yes. 2008, they asked, do you have an excellent relationship with your parents? 92% said yes. Now, I don't really believe that, but they want to have an excellent relationship. And so I do think, just in terms of getting people better relationships, I think it's helped. But as for intellectual development, I think it entirely depends on what you do with the internet. And here, I think it's a class divide. As I was talking at lunch, and I gave statistics about young people, and they're incredibly wholesome, productive, incredibly inspiring generation, so long as they have education. There's a huge divide into outcomes in this younger group. People who are graduating from high school and college are just amazing. People who are not are falling way behind at a very early age, and that goes back to the self-control and attachment issues I was talking about. So I don't think technology determines it one way or another. It's all about getting the right things and getting the right identity and the right ability to form human relationships, both online and in real life. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention.